We can't fix the world alone, but collaborating isn't easy, and systems are allergic to change. So, how do we do it without losing our damn minds?
That is what we're here to find out.
I'm Jeff Walker.
I'm English Sall. Welcome to System Catalyst, the podcast that cracks the code for making the world a better place. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, English. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I gotta be honest, I was having kind of a moment yesterday. I just was kind of feeling pretty unmotivated and kind of frustrated. And then I was telling this to my husband. I was just feeling kind of super down. And then guess what showed up at my door? A huge box of Girl Scout cookies that I had ordered 2 weeks ago.
Nice.
And immediately I ate an entire box of Thin Mints and felt better.
Thin Mints, my favorite.
Yep.
Samoas are good too.
Yeah, Samoas are good. What about you? How are you doing?
I'm doing good. When I'm talking to, some of the individuals who we've been interviewing, I'm getting this feeling. There's so many people that are doing some great work, but they're kind of down a little bit because there's so much going on in the world that's kind of depressing at times. And they want to have a positive impact. And I do too. And so looking at all of them, being able to kind of take the breath, focus on what we can do, and doing it with others is important to me and useful. And doing this with you is such a joy. So getting through these times, it's got to be hard for everybody.
Absolutely.
Well, our guest today, Jacqueline Novogratz, is the founder and CEO of Acumen, which is a global organization that's doing impact investing. And she's been in this business for almost 30 years. And so she's seen it all. And she talks about a lot of those things. And she has grown to become a true systems catalyst, really looking at system change, but doing it at approximate level, kind of looking at what we do on the ground and supporting small up and coming companies that hopefully grow large, that have an impact on things like workforce, health, the climate. So it's a fun story talking about her evolution over time, hopefully one that'll be instructive to people listening about how to get involved and who to get involved with.
That's awesome. She's, a veteran in this space, so I'm really excited to hear about any tips she has for longevity, and it'll be a great addition to our Philanthropy 101 toolkit.
Well, let's listen. So go back and maybe define the original definition of impact investing, because I think it has changed over time. So just for our audience, give them a little bit of education on that side.
Sure. When Acumen started, we had this one big idea, to your point, Jeff, which was that charity alone was too often subscale and didn't often enough focus on low-income people as customers and understand their needs and then structure goods and services to meet those needs. On the other hand, for-profit companies too often overlooked and sometimes exploited the poor. And that patient capital would try to do the best of both. We would take philanthropy, we would invest mostly equity, but sometimes long-term debt for 10 to 15 years. Any money that came back would be reinvested in innovation for the poor. The average length of time our investments take is about 8 years. As our companies grew, we realized that we needed to access more capital that wasn't available in the philanthropic sector. These were for-profit companies. It was time for us to start our first impact fund. And so we started to develop new tools, realizing that we could access philanthropy and investment vehicles more creatively if our end game was actually solving problems of poverty. And then, of course, you have to hold yourself to the financial viability of those companies and to showing that the subsidy that you've also brought in is having the intended form of impact, or else it's a lot of words. I see investing as a means, as a tool, not as the end in and of itself.
For those who don't know, patient capital is a kind of long-term investment that prioritizes a company's social impact over its financial gains. That means when Acumen invests in something, it's committed to it, even if it takes a long time to become profitable. Now, how exactly does Acumen use the market and entrepreneurship to trigger wide systematic change? Well, check out this example from their work in sub-Saharan Africa.
This is actually a story that starts in 2007. So it's for social entrepreneurs. I do think it's a story of systems change when 1.5 billion people had no access to electricity. We invested in one company, two co-founders, D-Light, who had an idea that they would bring solar to try and eradicate kerosene, which is dirty, expensive, highly polluting. It took, I would say, for the first 7 years, we weren't sure if they would go bankrupt or not. But over time, we watched this company start to understand what it actually means to build a market. And we understood that with them. And so we started investing in other off-grid solar lighting and electricity companies. We got to a point where we have about 40 companies that have reached more than 230 million low-income people with light and electricity. And so a few years ago, when I realized that this fairly modest portfolio, 40 companies, had moved the needle on electrification on a global level, I started to ask my team, well, what would it take to accomplish what the world has set out to accomplish, SDG 7, or universal electrification? After a few sort of heads in hands moments, we started thinking about analyzing the larger system. And if you look at where we are today, 700 million people have no access to electricity. About 220 million of those will not be reached by traditional markets. About 500 million now will. Those 220 million live in about 24 sub-Saharan African nations where the electrification rate is under 46%. But some countries like Chad have a 6% electrification rate, or Burkina Faso, 20%, but in the rural areas, much lower. Malawi, 14%. You cannot develop a country with a 6% electrification rate. And this is a continent that is going to double in population. It will represent 25% of all humanity by 2050. And so we've learned a lot, Jeff, about finding a problem and then structuring the right kind of capital to solve it, rather than just starting with the capital that we have and letting that be our only tool. And so based on all of that learning, we structured a $250 million initiative that's unapologetically part market creation philanthropy that gives us the ability to take super early stage equity and debt risk, as well as make grants to companies that are willing to go into some of these very challenging markets, and also provide affordable debt with a kicker, if you will. Again, using philanthropy so that if a company not only pays us back, but does so in a way that delivers on its promise, say to reach 1 million people with electricity, they can reduce the interest that they owe to the facility to zero.
It's a great story, and you guys are going to do great. And you partnered with the Green Climate Fund as well, right?
Yep. It's quite an extraordinary collaboration, actually, because you've got the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest climate financial institution in the world. Shinhan Bank, which is the largest commercial bank out of Asia, and USAID and other government assistance organizations. And so it also, for me, is what I dreamed of long, long ago, that we would move out of this bifurcated way of thinking about business, that on one side you had maximizing returns for shareholders, and then on the other side, giving it away as charity. This is much more, it took 20 years, but a much more nuanced and blended approach, which isolates the philanthropy and the subsidy where it's needed, uses the capital from markets in ways that allow for efficiencies, and hold all of us accountable to actually solving a problem.
Basically, Acumen helped create this new middle ground between charity and business. one where investors can support good causes and where social entrepreneurs grow their own wealth instead of being fully dependent on donors. Jacqueline has been doing this for nearly 25 years. Her book, Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, lays out the lessons she has learned along the way. I was reading your book the other night, and one quote stood out for me. It said, solving humanity's toughest problems requires no single hero, but a system of people, companies, organizations, and governments. Can you talk about that? And was that the way you always thought about it, or did that evolve over time?
That totally evolved over time. My early background, having built a bank with co-founders in Rwanda when I was in my 20s, made me very gun shy of government programs, subsidy programs, and complex partnerships. And yet what we saw over time was that if you're going to deliver goods and services using market forces, and you were solving a market failure, often the only way to do it was in partnership with government. It's something I see in what it actually takes to move from a single company to systems change. That you only do it when you learn how to push the different levers of a system that has often stayed in place for many generations and is the status quo. You often don't understand what that means until the entrepreneur has the courage to just start and build that company. And then at one point recognize that scaling or growing that company will only happen in partnership. And it's probably one of the most important lessons that I've taken away. And in this generation, when we're so interdependent, when these global forces are impacting all of us, I think that the ability to partner across sector is a skill that we need to do more teaching of in all of our schools, and especially in our business schools.
Hear, hear. A big reason why Acumen has been able to have such a massive societal impact is their ability to collaborate across sectors with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, governments, and even banks. There's a sea change going on in Africa where many of the efforts that were the Western world coming into Africa are now being subsumed by African-driven change, which is awesome. And leaders developing there and the government's taking even more control. And while we're all helping and hoping, finding ways to facilitate their success. Can you talk about that? And maybe around climate change, how do we support Africa but not try to come in and tell them the answers?
Well, first of all, I think we get rid of the word help.
Yeah.
And I learned this way back in the 80s, very painfully, because I went to save the world and learned that nobody wants saving. And even way back then, they certainly didn't want saving by an American woman who didn't know anything about the continent. And so early on, I learned I cannot be here if I am not willing to immerse, be in relationship, and realize that this is about investment and partnership. It is not about saving, helping, extracting. And it goes in some ways to the adage of give more than you take and commit not just for today, but until the problem is solved. Be there. And so when I look at some of the long-term investors who came into the continent, so not local Africans, and what their energy they're releasing, they have a number of similar characteristics. I think of Dave Ellis, a young guy who grew up in Chicago, went to Uganda to join a nonprofit 15 years ago, felt disappointed that the NGO wasn't really changing very much, and decided that he would start a company. At the time, just happened to be in Ethiopia, and heard that government was looking for someone to take over the chicken industry. He'd never held a chicken in his life, but he had that entrepreneurial curiosity, verve, and the humility to realize that he had to make a long-term commitment. He had to immerse, and he had to always consider himself a guest and behave that way until the point where people started to see him more as a local. Follows the same pattern that many of our patient capital investments took, which is first 5-7 years, teetering at the edge of bankruptcy. Dave learned fluent Amharic. He lived in Tigray, which is still the center of war. And he and his partners ultimately built a company in Ethiopia that represents now 80% of the chicken market. They've been credited with reducing childhood malnutrition. With one of our for-profit funds, we've helped them expand to another 6 African nations. This year, they will employ 16,000 agents. Those agents sell chicks to smallholder farmers, and those chicks will produce and sell 5 billion eggs. But it's been a 15-year journey. He is there as somebody who committed, who invested himself as well as capital, and who created a couple of thousands of jobs in addition to the 16,000 very good agent jobs. And so for the people coming in, I think that is a real model. You earn your way in, and you see part of your responsibility as enabling a new generation to take the mantle forward. And what's exciting to me is also to see the incredible array of African entrepreneurs. I am watching a new generation with a level of creativity and innovation that almost can only happen at the edges.
Mm-hmm.
And my hope, Jeff, is that we start to see more and more of those entrepreneurs influencing American entrepreneurs to bring these sort of radical and creative new economy models into a nation that also needs a lot of work.
Well, there's a lot of potential entrepreneurs, that's for sure. And I think you're right. The proximate change, right? Those that are local to the problem are going to have better solutions than those that are looking down.
Yeah. Or those who make themselves proximate to the problem.
And that may be a suggestion for our listeners is to, when you're going to start, go proximate, right?
When you're going to start, go proximate. And if you don't want to go proximate, don't go. If we don't invest any longer in those CEOs who live in Atlanta and have a company in pick your place, it better be in Atlanta. So,
right. You've got a lot of people located locally around the world. How do you keep them connected? How do you unify them? Is there a common culture that you're trying to make sure that when people come in, you kind of, okay, you're not going to work unless you kind of feel the following way or kind of operate in the following way. How do you do that?
I literally just got off a call before you and I spoke with my head of development partnerships, who's been with me for 22 years. And we talked about culture being the most important thing. And yesterday at my board meeting, I said to the board that as Acumen becomes more of a constellation, how can we make sure that no matter if you're walking into Acumen Academy Malaysia, the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, or Acumen in San Francisco, you're walking into a community that shares the same ethos, that may use slightly different tools, but does it in service of low-income people and does it in a way that respects all of our humanity, that operates from a place of dignity. That's work in and of itself. And probably now at this point, 10 years ago, we wrote a manifesto for Acumen. It's on the wall of every office that starts by standing with the poor, seeing a potential where others see despair, daring to go where markets and aids have fallen short. And it goes from there. There are lines like, it takes patience and kindness, resilience and grit, a hard-edged hope. It makes capital work for us, not control us. And Jeff, that manifesto, those words, and people gravitate to different parts of it. They are repeated throughout the Acumen universe in most meetings, including investment meetings where we have people from Goldman Sachs and other very, very respected financial institutions will look at an investment and say, well, what percentage of people impacted by this will fall below the poverty line? Oh, too low? Not going to do this investment. And so on. It doesn't mean that we're soft. In fact, we've written off about 25% of the investments that we have made, and you have to know when to walk away. But it does mean we're committed to trying to live up to these values because we've proven with 230 million people served that entrepreneurs know how to do this. We have the technology. What we need is the courage to construct the right kind of capital and not just talk in big numbers and feel good about ourselves, but to hold ourselves to account, to do what's needed so that we're not going to go into another 10 years where 250 million people have no chance of getting access to light after all these more than a century and a half since Edison invented the light bulb. We're not going to let that happen on our watch. And so I think constantly moving from there with great humility, because that means we'll fail, and we have failed many times, but also with this sense of possibility that you never let go of, but you're tethered by standing with impact and poor first. And as you know, in our generation, that was not such a popular idea. That was seen as a naive idea. Making money and then doing good things for the world was seen as the strong idea. I think the world is starting to acknowledge that our strength comes in solving these problems and doing so with all of ourselves, not with just a part of ourselves.
Really inspiring stuff. But of course, unless you lived under a rock for the last few years, we still have a lot of problems around the world. And in a recent interview, Jacqueline said that 2023 was one of the hardest years for Acumen. So I thought I'd ask her why. You talked about it's been a really hard year, but you keep going. Tell me about why it's been hard.
It's been one of those years, Jeff, that has been the best of times and the worst of times. It's been the best year in terms of Acumen's own growth and impact. We crossed 500 million people impacted. We also have about 150 million under management in for-profit impact funds, and right now are in process of building another 450 million in initiatives. And we had never had this expectation of managing $1 billion portfolio, but it seems that we will soon be there. And so in one sense, we've just seen enormous change and impact with our companies, with the funds and initiatives that we do. And on the other hand, we've been seeing this in the context of worsening climate crisis, our energy companies dealing with massive macroeconomic headwinds, the whole war in the Middle East, and what that has done to a sense of helplessness, division, divisiveness, confusion across the world, I think has also impacted and made us question who are we, where and how to lead in this moment. So it's been a time of a great sense of gratitude, my team would say, and pride, and also humility at what we're all up against.
How do you stay working in this area for so long without burning out, without, getting frustrated? You've been one of the longest committed. I remember, sitting in your offices so long ago, early 2000s, and hearing about what your ideas were and bringing people together. How do you keep it going? What keeps you on the path?
It's funny that you ask, because I just had a celebration with the team that most directly supports me. And so it's been such a year that I asked them, how are you all doing? Any signs of burnout here? Because we've pushed so hard. And one of them said, what you've really imprinted on me is that when you have something that you deeply care about and you see that you're making a difference within it, there's not really a place for burnout. And I think that is not inconsistent with also needing replenishment and renewal. But I think there's real wisdom in that for me anyway, I feel so privileged that I get to work on solving a problem that clearly I won't solve fully in my lifetime. But I have seen over these now 40 years since I first started that change is possible, and that ultimately it's people who make the change. And so I have been frustrated at times and I have been tired at times, but I've never had burnout. I've felt a deep privilege that I get to do this work.
Jacqueline's response reminded me of my conversation earlier this season with Ai-jen Poo, the president of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. You can find the link to that episode in the show notes. I interviewed Ai-jen Poo, and she was talking about the similar kind of frustration with the world while trying to keep focused on what she's doing. And it's hard to kind of separate it, but not care. And it takes a different kind of personal strength to do that. You have advice to people of how to thread that needle?
Such a great question. I do think that it's one of the modern challenges that we face as a world. In the 80s, when I lived in Kigali, Rwanda, and there were no telephones in my neighborhood, no internet. The only radio was shortwave, BBC, 7:30 in the morning, 7:30 at night. You could really stay focused on your locale. And sure, you'd hear through the BBC what was happening elsewhere in the world, but it didn't dominate your own body, mind. And I think now about how many young people I know are getting degrees in psychology for climate anxiety, social media and the divisiveness, all the wars, everything that's happening in the world. And so to be aware of it, but also to recognize each of us has to be used in the ways that we can most be useful with who we are, what we have, and where we are. And I think that the more we, at least the way I deal with it, the more I focus on making the kind of change that I'm capable of making, the more I'm actually contributing in a positive way to these other issues that are happening around the world. And if I let myself just get overwhelmed with what's swirling around me, it will ultimately lead to inaction and reduce my ability to actually make the kind of change that I can make. And it's always been a practice that I've been lucky to have, but I see it in a new generation that I think it's become more challenging and maybe more important then to develop those practices whereby we ask ourselves, what is it that I can do? And it can be very small or it can be much larger, but to focus on the work and the action beyond just sort of screaming into the void, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, each of those small actions reverberates into much larger waves.
In ways we never even may know.
Right. Is there anything that you want to make sure people hear as the message as to if they want to be like you?
I don't think I would.
Or be system catalysts or be people that can help unify and think of the larger we? Where would you go?
When we first started Acumen Academy, which, as I said, is both a fellowship program, and we have fellowship programs running in 10 countries, and an online learning platform that we are right now renewing and taking to another level. So hopefully over this next year, you'll see real growth and short-term resources.
It has amazing people on it, by the way. Adam Grant and Chris Anderson and Krista Tippett and Daniel Pink and a bunch of others. So love the cast.
Well, it's a great cast. And in our next chapter, it will be of, by, and for builders. So people who've actually built in kinds of communities that innovators come from and want to impact. And so, as I said, we're just getting started with that next chapter, but I'm so excited. And when I first started to think about Acumen Academy, I was talking to Nico Canner, who's an amazing advisor, about what we were trying to do. And he drew 3 circles on the wall, and they were intersecting. Operational skills, financial skills, and then one we never talk about in our business schools, the moral imagination, which is something that has always been very important to me in terms of solving problems of poverty across lines of difference, particularly with low-income people. And I think for this generation of people who want to innovate and to solve problems at systems level, the moral imagination is fundamental. It starts with curiosity and with empathy, whereby you see a problem and want to be part of solving it. You may not have any idea how to do it. So next step, follow the thread of your curiosity. Get proximate, immerse, get close, understand the people who are impacted. What does the system hold them back? And where might they hold themselves back? Which requires deep listening. From there, start to look at the different pieces of the system so that you understand what the status quo actually is. It might surprise you. And then figure out what piece of it do you want to take on. And you figure that out by starting and letting the work teach you. You also figure out by acknowledging what resources, what strengths, what personality traits you have right here, right now, and move from that place. Don't wait till you have acquired all of these idealized versions of yourself. Start with who you are right now. Take a step. If you fall down, get up and take another step. And be willing to stay that path. And that's when 15 years looking forward can seem like a long time, as you know, Jeff. But 15 years looking back goes like that. And the amount of change that is possible might really surprise you.
That's it for today's show. Please don't forget to subscribe to System Catalyst so you don't miss out on the new episodes. Also, do us a huge favor by rating our podcast and leaving us a review. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you all in the next episode. Before we go, I'd like to thank our producers at Human Group Media. We'd also like to thank our incredible network of partners who are supporting our mission: the Skoll Foundation, the Aspen Institute's Aspen Global Leadership Network, Echo and Green, DRK Foundation, Maverick Collective, Virgin Unite, Charlize Theron Africa Outreach Project, Boldly Go Philanthropy, Synergos, Forward Global, Nexus, and New Profit. If you're interested in becoming a System Catalyst and would like to learn more about our partners, please visit systemcatalyst.com.